Good afternoon, dear excellencies, speakers, distinguished guests. I would like to welcome you to our workshop that is called Chinese Communist Party Information Warfare and PRC Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. Our debate is organized by the non-profit project Synopsis, organization Acamedia, and co-organized by the Embassy of the United States in the Czech Republic and the Taipei Economic and Culture Office in the Czech Republic. Firstly, let me inform you a bit about our program. This is a second panel. Second session is a public one. And this session will summarize the case studies that we discussed earlier in more details. Let me maybe tell you a bit more about our Project Synopsis, who we are. Project Synopsis was founded 5 years ago as a response to the changes in foreign policy orientation in the Czech Republic specifically, and the Central Eastern European countries more broadly. In the last 5 years, we have published over 1,000 articles or text, mostly in Czech language, but also increasingly in English. That are the results of research collaboration with analysts in Europe and elsewhere in the world. In the Czech Republic, we have scored a number of scoops, and if I may say, we have basically drive the domestic discussion on China. Our English language output attracts attention abroad and is becoming an integral part of growing body of research on contemporary China. So that's something about a synopsis for those who didn't know us. And now let me introduce our speakers of our second panel. I would start with His Excellency Liang Ruike, representative of Taipei Economic and Culture Office in the Czech Republic. Excellency, welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure having you here. Then I would like to introduce Madame Erika Kuhn, political officer from the U.S. Embassy in the Czech Republic. Erika, welcome. Then we have speakers here, Martin Hala, Director of Project Synopsis and Professor at Charles University. Martin, welcome. Nice that you are staying with us. And Professor Olga Lomová, who is with us online. She's a teacher, professor at Charles University, Academia Chair of the Board, and also Synopsis contributor. Professor Lomová, welcome again. And our last speaker is Didi Kirsten Tato. Didi is fellow, she's working for DGAP, she's a fellow at DGAP, and also in Synopsis. So Didi, welcome here, the second panel as well. So now let me probably start and give a floor to His Excellency. Please.
Thank you and good afternoon. As recently as a couple of years ago, rapid economic growth in China had attracted worldwide attention. Until then, people have spoken more of opportunity than risk about China. Many hope that its integration into the rule-based international order and respect for human rights would soon prevail. What followed, however, were aggressive approaches such as information warfare and wolf warrior diplomacy. This threatened to undermine public trust to government, create confusion, or sometimes sway policy decision-making in target countries. A study by the University of Gothenburg in Sweden found that Taiwan received the most information attacks from foreign sources, with tendency to exacerbate before elections and during pandemic time. When President Vystrčil of Czech Senate led a delegation to promote democratic and economic cooperation in Taiwan last autumn, the PRC threatened that they must pay a heavy price. The fact that Taiwan has been excluded from the World Health Assembly since 2017 also demonstrated that the PRC's influence in international organization can compromise global efforts against the pandemic. At a time when no one is safe until everyone is safe, It is important that Taiwan can benefit from the discussion and updates of the World Health Organization, and also contribute its medical expertise and lessons. The PRC information warfare and the comparative diplomatic approaches are encroaching on our institutions and diplomatic way and democratic way of life. Today, we are living in a world where distance between continents provides little protection from pandemic or foreign influence. It has become clear that democratic countries need to raise vigilance and constantly strengthen their capacity to counter new types of assaults from authoritarian countries, such as information warfare and wolf warrior diplomacy. People in Taiwan are grateful for vaccine assistance from the United States, Japan, Lithuania, and Slovakia, as Taiwan faced complications in procuring vaccines. The assistance helped protect life in Taiwan and showed solidarity of like-minded countries in times of difficulty and uncertainty. I believe this solidarity of like-minded countries highlights the purpose of today's debate. I'm sure we will share insights and explore ideas to support each other and to protect our values and way of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. And now I would like to give the floor to Erika Keen from American Embassy, please.
Thank you, Katerina. The U.S. Embassy is pleased to co-sponsor this workshop with Synopsis and also TechCo. Our friendship, U.S. friendship with Taiwan is based on our shared values, cultural affinity, and also economic ties. And with that, I'd like to say it's my honor to be here with Representative Ke today. Of course, I'd also like to thank Synopsis for organizing the panel. Synopsis, the leadership under Martin Hala and Olga Lomova, I think it's actually undeniable that they are leaders in this field, and they have reshaped the conversation about China not only here in Prague in the Czech Republic, but also throughout Europe. So thank you again for your expertise and contributions. Similar to Mr. Ke, I would like to mention that PRC propaganda and disinformation is aimed squarely at our democratic institutions, processes, and values. These efforts, especially in the realm of COVID disinformation, have sought to paint democracies as less effective systems of government and also to characterize our pluralistic, diverse, and open societies as the source of conflict and instability. Of course, we disagree. We believe these same values make democratic societies more resilient, innovative, and better able to meet the evolving needs of our diverse populations. Beijing employs, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this today on the panel, Beijing employs a combination of tools to influence international public discourse, suppress criticism, including what we heard earlier, especially on narratives related to Xinjiang and debate, and also to shape political preferences. This poses a long-term challenge to like-minded global democracies. The PRC's decade, we are actually all familiar, and I think especially in a former communist country like Czech Republic, we are familiar with censorship. The PRC's decades-long effort to control information within China is well documented. But now we have seen a body of research that shows Beijing's censorship and silencing of voices within China is now matched by its efforts to push propaganda and disinformation outward using a massive information ecosystem. There's growing consensus among like-minded democracies on the need to build resilience to, expose, and impose costs for the PRC's coercive and corrupting behavior. The United States will continue to work with like-minded allies and partners, including multilaterally, to build an open and resilient global information process. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to a robust discussion on these issues. With that, I'll hand it over to the experts.
Thank you very much, Erika. And I will pass the microphone to Martin Hala.
Well, thank you, Katarzyna. And welcome to everybody here who joined us for this second panel, and welcome to everybody who watches this online. As Katarzyna mentioned, this is already the second panel, which is supposed to summarize the case studies that we have discussed in the morning. So we will probably not be going into too much detail here, also because of the limitations of time, because this is a rather short discussion. So let me just try to summarize some of the points that I tried to make in the morning. Basically, I was talking about how the pandemic last year in 2020 opened the door for new forms of CCP propaganda and disinformation, and also how it helped to bring back, at least temporarily, the pro-Beijing lobby in the Czech Republic that had previously been largely discredited by the failure of the so-called economic diplomacy. I try to make some points about the distinction between the theoretical distinction between propaganda and disinformation, and this point perhaps may be worth repeating at this open session. So in everyday parlance, these two terms, propaganda and disinformation, are often mentioned in the same breath, but there are important differences to be aware of. Propaganda is largely a positive strategic narrative. It paints its subject in rosy colors in order to win other people over to one side, while disinformation, in contrast, is typically a tactical sub-narrative meant to undermine the other side's image or counter a specific inconvenient fact or argument. By definition, disinformation is mostly negative, usually deployed ad hoc, with a relatively short shelf life. And in practice, disinformation provides tactical support for the more strategic, the broader propaganda. So we also discussed that the Communist Party of China, the CCP, traditionally had been focusing more on propaganda by promoting the supposed superiority of the Chinese system and the inevitability of its eventual triumph. The focus on disinformation is relatively new in coming from China. Previously, it had been more typical of Russia, and before that of the USSR. The first large-scale deployment of CCP disinformation probably came during the last presidential elections in Taiwan that already preceded the pandemic. But that was limited geographically, as well as culturally and linguistically, to a relatively narrow area in East Asia. But it seems that the truly large-scale deployment of disinformation in a complex international environment only came with the pandemic last year, because suddenly the grand narrative of the Communist Party, of its superiority, of the superior social and political model in the PRC, was shattered. So it needed to be supported by new approaches. We in the Czech Republic have also experienced this shift in tactic from the People's Republic of China in its propaganda and disinformation in a specific national context, so in a sort of a localized form. Previously in the Czech Republic, the Chinese propaganda really mostly followed the positive narrative, mostly of the so-called economic diplomacy, the supposed advantages of close collaboration with the People's Republic of China in the economic area. That was expected to bring massive economic benefits to the Czech Republic. There, of course, didn't quite happen, as we know by now. This narrative collapsed in 2018 with the demise of the one Chinese company that symbolized and epitomized it, the now quite notorious CEFC. The company, as you will remember, was hailed in its heyday as the flagship of Chinese investment in the Czech Republic. But later on, in 2018, it turned out to be a massive financial fraud. And not only that, but one of its representatives was apprehended and later on convicted on charges of large-scale political corruption in Africa and in the United Nations. So that pretty much ended the economic diplomacy narrative in the Czech Republic. But with the pandemic, new opportunities opened up with the so-called face mask diplomacy, which provided an opening for the positive propaganda to return in the form of, by claiming that the face mask shipments, the shipments of PPEs, the personal protective equipment from the People's Republic of China, will save the Czech population from the pandemic. So instead of the investments, now it was the face masks that were supposed to save the country and its population. The pinnacle of this narrative probably was the events of March 20 last year, when half of the Czech government lined up at the airport in Prague to welcome a cargo plane coming from China bringing this equipment. There was also kind of a turning point because the show of submissive diplomatic behavior at the airport didn't go down very well with the Czech population. So from that point on, the face mask diplomacy was probably on the back foot and gradually faded away. So I think, just to summarize the point I was trying to make in the morning, the pandemic offered a new opening for the Chinese propaganda and disinformation in this country. It was taken up by some of the local politicians at the beginning of the crisis, but it didn't quite last, and in the end, I think there will probably very little in terms of lasting effects of this effort. Thank you.
Martin, thank you for your contribution. And now I would ask Didi if she would add her short summary, probably, her first panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will be brief. So this morning we did talk about quite a bit of detail. I think to summarize that, in Germany what we see is fair amount of, we've had prominent cases of pandemic profiteering through mask business, which have touched politics and other interests. And I think also that it's important to mention here that last year, when the pandemic was kind of at its worst, there was also a publicized incident of that the PRC government had instructed its employees, for example, diplomats, but not just, to reach to all contacts that they had in the German government, all kinds of officials, to ask them in a friendly way to promote China's handling of the pandemic as an effective, successful, efficient model, of course, compared to the chaos actually that we had in Germany for quite a long time. And what's interesting about this is that it kind of backfired, because the Interior Ministry in Germany put out a warning saying, this is happening, we don't like it, we regard it as interference. And that warning, I think, was the first time we've at least publicly heard of something like this, had the effect of raising the threat perception in Germany about this kind of behavior, and was immensely, I think, helpful to, people who don't like that type of interference and influencing attempts conducted privately and on a massive organized scale, and attacking, very much an incredibly sensitive social political issue at that moment. So that kind of backfired. Another thing I think is that we have to mention importantly here is we have an election coming up in Germany on the 26th of September. Chancellor Merkel will leave office one way or the other, she says, after 16 years. And so far we haven't seen too many overt attempts to involve, publicly comment on, that kind of thing from the PRC side. And one reason for that, I think, is probably because things are going quite well for China in the German election, and in the sense that they think that the overall situation is going quite well for them, so they're not going to really interfere. And I think that is reflected on a point we talked about earlier, about the person of the ambassador Wu Kan, who is has in fact once made a very pointed comment in Germany about don't keep us out of your 5G because there's always the German car industry, and it would be terrible if something happened to that. And that comment was really picked up. People registered and went, oh no, because it is, of course, Germany's great vulnerability. Just to wrap up, I think briefly to say that it might be worth adding that the security services in Germany don't have a very good historical reputation. As all of you will know, this has to do with the history of fascism and communism in Germany. However, they do very good annual reports. The domestic agency, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, the BFV, does actually a very good annual report. And I've been noting over the last 4 years that their reports on China is literally getting longer every year. So when I got back to Germany in 2017, it was like 4 pages, then it was 5, then it was 6, now it's 7, now it's 8. So it's literally growing every year. And there's some pretty good analysis in there. And they also warn about really an increase after this pandemic year of interference in the political and economic processes in Germany, often by pulling in very highly placed lobbyists who are German, to argue for China's cause within the fabric of German society and industry. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Didi Kirsten Tatlow. And I'm sorry, now I would like to get connected with Professor Lomová, who would have her presentation. Professor Lomová, please, now it's your time.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? Yes.
Perfectly.
So good afternoon, everybody. I spoke in the morning and will summarize it now about a broader context of the political system and its ideology and its history that actually creates, let's say, a natural environment for all the negative things we discussed. I mean, the Ambassador Kerr mentioned the extravagant behavior of Chinese diplomats, which was very diplomatically said, and both the assertive moves, attempts to influence, disinformation, etc., etc. And I always try to contextualize these contemporary events in historical context. Well, of course, because the Chinese leadership itself is constantly connecting itself with its own history. Today, this year, we have the 100 years of the Communist Party of China. The history is, of course, constantly reinterpreted and adapted to the current needs, but the basis remains the same. This is the conviction that the Communist Party is the avant-garde of the new social and political system, which, according to the teaching of Marxism-Leninism, is supposed to be scientifically proven force to bring new socio-economic formation to the mankind. And we should not forget about it, that Marxism-Leninism remains the basic framework for Chinese ideology and Chinese politics. And second reason why I often emphasize the historical context is that we in the West, if we are not historians, if we are politicians or media people, we usually forget about it. We perceive what's happening just now. We are dazzled by the economic development. We remember the collapse of the Soviet Union, the most famous communist superpower. And there, until recently, was a broad consensus in the non-specialist environment that communism in China will eventually end, perhaps rather soon, as a result of market reforms, rising consumerism, and involvement of China in international organizations, which actually in recent years is proving to be wrong. And we can see that actually the political system is getting more and more self-assured, more and more inclined to promote itself as the solution of global problems, and threatens the rules-based, liberal Western democratic system, which we are part of, and despite all the problems we encounter, I guess we are very happy to be part of. I reminded the listeners that People's Republic of China was established as a result of the victory of communist revolution and victory in the civil war, that it is the political system is closely related to its military, and military remains, military values like fighting spirit, military discipline, that remain highly valued in Chinese propaganda, education, and this is actually projected also into the behavior, the recent behavior of Chinese diplomats and other subjects internationally. The second point I did in relation to history is Xi Jinping's constant reference to returning back to the original ideas, to the original mission of the country, which reminds us we should really pay attention and not have illusions about the political change ripening in China. I also mentioned that in the past, decades, Chinese diplomacy had two phases, and there were periods and trends in Chinese diplomacy in late 1950s, 1960s, which were actually aggressive and very much in the manner of what we now see transformed by social media and the new global environments as the so-called wolf diplomacy. And that if we think about Mao Zedong, whom Xi Jinping constantly invokes as the most important leader in modern Chinese history, and whose portrait is hanging on the Tiananmen Gate, Mao Zedong claimed the victory of the East over the West in the spirit of Marxism-Leninism I just mentioned. And Xi Jinping today, perhaps distantly invoking the famous Mao Zedong saying, and definitely inspired by Marxism-Leninism, claims that the West is in decline, and now it is the moment for China to prove the scientific truths of Marxism-Leninism, and that socialism will win over imperialism. I also mentioned a popular nationalistic spirit of the Chinese population. I often ask myself a question: to what degree this popular nationalism just grows from below, and to what degree it is cultivated from above. It is definitely supported and enabled from above. If we imagine the censorship and the tight control of media in today's People's Republic of China, it's hard to imagine that these nationalistic and sometimes very, let's say, rude and violent nationalistic sentiments that are present in the Chinese internet would be possible without the consent of the government and the party leadership. And I pointed out that we very often misunderstand and have a misled perception of Chinese society, environment, feelings, which are shaped by our own expectations and by our own cultural experience. And I made an example with the name of wolf diplomacy being derived from the blockbuster military nationalistic film Wolf Warrior. This is well known, but I also mentioned another wolf spirit which appeared in China already in early 21st century in the film, in the novel Wolf Totem, which was a bestseller, selling incredible, I think, 1 million copies in a very short time, and in which the main protagonist of the story complains of lack of fighting spirit among the Chinese nation, talking about the Chinese as docile and sheepish, and demands that infusions, now I quote, infusions of wolf blood should be given to the Chinese people in order to survive the global competition. And when I remember the novel, because it was quite shocking for me when I read it back in 2004, this kind of rhetoric reminding me of Nazi propaganda. It sometimes comes to my mind that actually the dream of this popular novel writer is coming true in wolf diplomacy, when there is no lack of wolf's blood in the veins of the diplomats active on the social media platforms. And I raised this example because the novel was translated into English and other Western languages, including Czech, and was actually centered of these very strange statements and very, I mean, unappealing statements for Western audience, becoming just a romantic story. And I raised the case because this was something that we encountered in the West, but we completely misunderstood and adapted again to our own expectation and imagination. And we should have a clear vision of what's going on in China, very clear and free of our preconceived ideas, in order to be able to understand properly and prepare ourselves for proper response to the Chinese pressure. And that's it, the role of history in contemporary society. Thank you.
Professor Lomova, thank you very much for your contribution on wolf warrior diplomacy. And now I would like to invite here among us a new participant, a new speaker, Monika Richter from Semantic Visions, a software-based analytic firm. Was based in Prague and London, if I'm right as well. So Monika, welcome, and please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yeah, wonderful. So on this panel, I am the only person who is not a China expert per se. So perhaps you should take what I say with a grain of salt by comparison to my colleagues. But I can't hear clearly. I'm sorry.
Somebody
Is it the problem with the microphone?
Press it. No, it's working.
Thank you. Thank you. Is that better?
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
So actually taking advantage of the fact that my background is in the analysis of information warfare more broadly, and working now for a software analytics company that uses big data semantic analysis and compiles 90% of the world's online news content in 12 languages. We have the unique ability to take a bird's eye view of how disinformation and information operations play out at the macro level around the world. And so I hope that this contribution adds some additional context for what has been discussed here to date. So one of the most notable developments around the COVID-19 pandemic has been the convergence of the so-called disinformation triad. That is Russia, China, and Iran. And since the very beginning of the pandemic, these authoritarian regimes saw an expedient opportunity to weaponize the crisis in furtherance of their strategic objectives, which they largely actualized through a global battle of narratives, but not only through that, also through the very sophisticated and savvy deployment of soft power. All of this was aimed at undermining Western democracies, or in fact, democracies around the world, and their responses to the pandemic. To this end, Russia, China, and Iran deployed a multi-pronged sharp power toolkit that encompassed, as I think we all know here, cover-ups, propaganda, overt and covert disinformation campaigns, and manipulative public diplomacy initiatives in third countries. Most significantly, their efforts revealed a truly unprecedented tactical convergence and opportunistic reinforcement of each other's messaging, with a particular focus on sowing doubts about the origins of the virus and portraying democratic governments as incapable of managing the crisis. Beginning in March 2020, Russian, Chinese, and Iranian disinformation networks engaged in the symbiotic amplification of COVID-19 disinformation and conspiracy theories on a global scale, creating a really interesting, mutually reinforcing nexus between official state media, pro-government social media accounts, and fringe websites. Now, of course, Russia, given its experience in this field, was the fastest to launch a disinformation campaign following the news of the coronavirus outbreak, and in fact seeded the conspiracy theory that the virus was a Western-made bioweapon as early as January 20th, 2020, according to our analysis at Semantic Visions. But now China very quickly joined the chorus with similar tactics, including vocal promotion of anti-Western conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus. Uniquely, in the Chinese case, these deceptive messages and conspiracy theories were pushed by official government representatives, as well as state media, and piggybacked upon disinformation narratives that were already circulating in Russian media and on international fringe websites. This venture into the Kremlin's established brand of disinformation marked quite a significant term in China's information control strategy. And since we're talking about the triad, I'll just add that Iran was ultimately less active than both Russia and China, ultimately just amplifying Russian and Chinese conspiracy theories on social media and through its international state-run news outlet, Press TV. The narrative overlap between Russia, China, and Iran has persisted to the present, evolving to disinformation about COVID-19 vaccines since last August. Of course, the high-stakes race to develop a vaccine has been a major political priority both for Moscow and Beijing, who see their control of a successful vaccine as a means for exerting greater geopolitical influence. As a result, as we are increasingly finding out, both Russia and China prioritized political gain over science and attempted to shortcut the vaccine development process by ignoring scientific research protocols as well as public health and safety standards. At the same time, the regimes deployed disinformation campaigns to undermine trust in our Western-made vaccines while touting their own, but notably not each other's. So China, of course, promoted Sputnik 5, and China the Sinovac, but not vice versa. And at the same time, they also falsely claimed that Western news outlets were biased in their coverage of the Russian and Chinese vaccines and were ignoring the safety concerns related to Western-made vaccines. Now, an important point in all of this is that there is no evidence of coordination behind this narrative alignment. Rather, the convergence is simply opportunistic and based on shared grievances rather than common strategic interests. And this is because the authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, and Iran all resent the US or NATO-led international order for its emphasis on democratic principles like human rights and the rule of law. While these states have otherwise divergent foreign policy objectives, they do have a shared interest in undermining these values at the global scale, and the COVID-19 crisis provided a truly unique opportunity and fertile ground for these efforts, allowing authoritarian regimes to learn from one another and synchronize their disinformation strategy in real time. Indeed, I think this is particularly remarkable, and it augurs poorly for the future because COVID-19 was a trial run. But this convergence represents a novel and significant development in authoritarian learning, which is the phenomenon by which non-democratic regimes observe and adapt survival strategies from one another. Perhaps the most telling example of this development is demonstrated indeed by the shift in China's information strategy to mimic the aggressive disinformation tactics that have been the traditional purview of the Kremlin. Martin and the other panelists spoke to this. While the Chinese government has honed the use of censorship and propaganda vis-a-vis its own citizens primarily over the years and in its near abroad, Chinese information operations aimed at international audiences have been comparatively conservative, with some exceptions, and focused primarily on promoting positive messages about China and attempting to suppress any information that casts the party state in a negative light. This cautious approach, relatively speaking, to information control rather than disruption long represented a stark contrast to the Kremlin's subversive disinformation strategy, which is not based on promoting really any positive messages about Russia, but rather serves explicitly as a means of political warfare against democratic societies. The COVID-19 pandemic, though, was, of course, as we all know, a watershed moment that changed Beijing's calculus in favor of a notably more confrontational approach in the information space. As the source of the virus and faced with international criticism and censure for its early cover-up of the outbreak, China very rapidly deployed an ambitious information offensive aimed at managing reputational fallout and manipulating international public opinion to its favor. In practice, this involved two strategies. The first, as we've discussed, was a global disinformation campaign, using both overt and covert means resembling the familiar Russian playbook to rewrite the facts of the pandemic in terms advantageous to the Chinese party state. On social media, for example, Chinese government and embassy accounts began promoting conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus in order to deflect blame from China and point the finger at the United States and allies. One of the earliest examples of this tactical shift came on March 12th, 2020, when Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson tweeted that the US Army may have brought the coronavirus to Wuhan and that the US thus owes China an explanation. Meanwhile, Chinese state media criticized the response of Western governments to the pandemic, emphasizing the message that was key to China's broader information strategy, that unlike the Chinese system, democracies are chaotic, unstable, and ill-equipped to protect their citizens. Official Chinese messengers also actively amplified Russian and Iranian disinformation networks, which pushed the same conspiracist and anti-Western messaging around the pandemic. The second element of the Chinese response entailed the so-called mask diplomacy, the much publicized provision of personal protective equipment, testing kits and medical support to third countries. But as we know, these efforts were manipulative from the outset. China targeted the hardest hit European states, namely Italy and Spain, where many had legitimate frustrations about the delay and lack of coordination in EU support. In this regard, I would place significant blame on the EU for failing to foresee precisely how this failure to demonstrate solidarity with vulnerable members opened the door for this kind of exploitation. Ultimately, the aid deliveries were thus used to underscore the narrative that the EU was incapable of managing the pandemic and caring for its citizens, and instead had to be, quote unquote, saved by China, which had successfully brought the virus under control. Of course, conveniently, Beijing failed to acknowledge that in the early weeks of the epidemic in Wuhan, the EU had in fact sent rapid aid to China. So this was unmentioned in the propaganda in Europe later on in the pandemic. And ultimately, of course, it came to light that in several cases, aid was nothing of the sort, but simply standard exports that European countries had themselves purchased from China. And finally, adding insult to injury, those materials often proved to be defective and had to be discarded, leading to continued shortages. So our team at Semantic Visions conducted a comparative analysis of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian info ops around the COVID-19 pandemic. And we took Spain, which was one of the hardest hit countries in Europe, as a case study. We assessed the pandemic through 3 phases. The first was disinformation campaigns about the origins of the coronavirus from January to April 2020. The second was mask diplomacy combined with disinformation denigrating Western governments for their pandemic response. That was from about April to August of 2020, according to our analysis. And the third was vaccine diplomacy combined with disinformation about the efficacy of Western-made vaccines. Corresponding with these categories, Chinese disinfo efforts around COVID in Spain involved 3 unique narratives. The first was the promotion of Chinese mask diplomacy. The second was denigration of the US and its pandemic response. And third was the promotion of the Sinovac vaccine. And in doing this analysis, we've focused our efforts on 4 official Chinese state media that have Spanish language editions, although these target Latin American audiences as well as Spain. And we found that in targeting the Spanish-speaking audience in Spain, I should say, not in Latin America, China's activities changed considerably during the different phases of the pandemic. In phase 1 and part of phase 2, China was very active in Spain and Europe and concentrated on portraying itself as a humanitarian superpower, saving the European continent with its deliveries of PPE, and on tarnishing the image and reputation of the United States. The initial success of this PR campaign, though, was eventually overshadowed by a backlash over the dissatisfactory quality of China's aid to Europe and its aggressive attempt to use the crisis to promote its foreign policy goals and doubts over the veracity of data and information provided by China during the early stages of the pandemic. The trends that we saw in Spain, by the way, largely reflected what was happening in other European countries as well. So the backlash certainly was not unique to Spain. That was something that was observed throughout Europe. And in phase 3, China's attention actually shifted mainly from Europe towards Latin America, at least in its Spanish language outlets. Its vaccine propaganda notably started later, quite a bit later, in fact, than Russia's, and ultimately never gained nearly as much traction as Russian efforts to promote the Sputnik V vaccine. While Russia focused on creating favorable conditions for the approval of its vaccine in Europe, which it viewed as an enormous political priority, China opted for a different approach, namely showcasing the demand for its vaccine around the world and presenting itself as a global humanitarian, industrial, scientific superpower. And notably, those efforts to promote the Sinovac vaccine in the Spanish language analysis that we did focused far more on Latin America than on Spain, most likely because there was a strategic assessment that sale of the vaccine would be far more successful in Latin America ultimately than in Europe. Chinese information operations during the pandemic differed from its activities in the pre-COVID era. The traditional reliance on self-promotion has been complemented with a considerably more confrontational approach, represented by the anti-US messaging in particular. And it remains to be seen to what degree this persists as the pandemic enters its final stages, and whatever may come post-pandemic. I'll conclude just by saying that, again, this point about the incredibly savvy authoritarian learning, the ability to learn survival mechanisms very rapidly from countries that have, or authoritarian regimes that have strengths in particular domains, is something that will continue to be, I think, a very important frontier in the study and assessment of these conflicts. For example, China had much more sort of early focus, even prior to the pandemic, on manipulative public diplomacy initiatives in different countries. And uniquely, Russia actually picked this up very quickly from China, and also in the early stages of the pandemic, began deploying soft power deliveries of medical aid to different countries. This was something that the Russians had not really previously done. So again, this learning was mutual. It went both ways. And it's something that we'll have to keep an eye on. Thank you.
Monika, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have, our time is flying, so we have 5 minutes for questions. So let's see if we are going to answer all of them. At first, let me check our chat. There's one question for His Excellency. So I would ask this, and then, of course, if there are any questions from audience, please just raise your hand and we will give you a microphone. So, Excellency, let me ask this question that came through a chat. That's from Madame Eva Železná, Senior Policy Officer at British Embassy in Prague. And she's asking or saying, we all are watching closely the recent pre-election public polls and mentions of possible future relations with China in the political parties' programs. I was truly surprised by a sentence in the program of Pirate Party where they say that they would like to establish economic, culture and diplomatic ties with Taiwan. My question is whether any of the political parties have been in close touch with you, and how do you think that the upcoming elections can influence Czech Republic position towards China? So, Excellency, that's a tough question for you.
Thank you for the question, though. The work for the Taipei Ethnic and Cultural Office Prague is to promote the bilateral relations between Taiwan and the Czech Republic. And we welcome any concrete and substantial steps. The upcoming election is certainly important for the Czech Republic. Any result of the election is the choice of the Czech people here, but Taiwan looks to the Czech Republic as a friend where support in many aspects has already shown to the people of Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for a diplomatic answer. And now, if there are any more questions from audience, I'll be happy to pass you our microphone. If not, that's perfect. That's great timing. So let me please thank you, our speakers, for sharing their opinions and ideas. Thank you all for meeting us, some of you face-to-face, some of you with face masks, some of you online. And I hope to see you again. Please stay with synopsis, I would say, with all of us. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.